I'm working on the outline stitch, which is probably the second most common stitch that you will do to put these stocking kits together. It's a very versatile stitch because you can use it to cover great areas or little tiny areas of details. So this is one that you'll get a lot of practice at most likely. Basically what you do is you overlap each successive stitch over the previous stitch. Oops, a little knot here, I'm just having an issue with. And sometimes this happens when you have your embroidery floss at its longest. They like to get all looped around each other. You know, as you're pulling the floss through your project, you're constantly twisting and turning your needle as you go, so little snarls and knots are rather inevitable in these projects, so you might have to stop fairly often and clean them up. So I'm hoping you can see against this white felt with the blue floss how these stitches overlap. Basically, I'm starting the next stitch about half a stitch length in front of the previous stitch and ending it in the middle of the previous stitch. And it gives a nice little roped effect to it when you get it right. Now I'm going to show you how to do this off jumping to another part of it where I have a second line going, and I'm ending this. It's going right off of the felt edge, and this is pretty common in these kits that the stitching goes right off the edge of the felt, and the felt can have different thicknesses here, and sometimes you lose it. So I'm angling my needle back towards the thicker part of the felt to make sure it has a nice little anchor. It doesn't just pull off the edge. But I want it to look like it's going right off the edge as much as I can. And I think that's as close as I'm going to get on this one. So I can't do my knot right on the edge, so I'm going to sew back along the back side through the previous stitching on the back side and carry my thread a little farther in so I can knot it neatly in here where it will be secure. Okay, like I said, you use this stitch a lot, and I wanted to show you on this same stocking another place where the outline stitch will be, and in this case it has to make a little nice curlicue, and it requires taking a smaller stitch. If you have to have a little more control over exactly the direction of the thread, it usually means you got to take a smaller stitch. If you get a point, if you're making the stitch and the next stitch you make around the curl turns into a point, then your stitch was too large. You need to go back, undo it, and do a smaller stitch. So in this area, this whole area of the chimney smoke coming out into the sky, I'm just doing smaller stitches than I did in the previous area where I had a gentle curve and I could take a little bit bigger stitch and get done quicker. But in areas with a little more detail, you got to slow down and do a smaller stitch. And if you're ever having trouble pulling your needle through, remember, get a new needle. I just threw a needle away the other day. I pulled it through once and it sounded like it was pulling through styrofoam, and the best thing to do is to get a new needle because that will drive you crazy. So I'm going to overlap right here on top of my previous stitch, getting close to it, trying to just be consistent. Oops, time to all that twisting and turning. Sometimes just a little hanging down of the needle like that to let it untwist is enough to keep you going for a few more stitches. Sometimes you have to actually take the needle off the floss and untwist the floss, just running your needle gently through the strands to work out all that twisting. If you're going to go through all this trouble to make this beautiful embroidery work, you want your floss to look good and not all tangled and twisted. So take the time to fix them. Now, knots are a part of the process, unfortunately. I think at least once in every stocking project, I get a knot that I just can't work out, and I have to cut in the middle of the stitching and do my best to pick up and start over again. All right, and yet again, another section of this stocking with the outline stitch. And I want to show you how to start it after you've had to add new floss. You've run out, knotted it, time to start a new part. So I'm bringing my needle up in the middle of the last stitch that I made and trying as much to duplicate the same length that I've been doing. I actually stopped last night, so I'm starting the next day. You know, I don't like to do that because my stitch length may not be quite the same when I have hours, days, weeks, months in between starting and stopping on a section. So I'm going to make sure, I'm going to take 3 or 4 stitches and look at it and really decide if this looks like it's melding in nicely. Of course, there's another rat's nest we got to pull through. And I think this looks like I didn't stop and start in the middle of it. I want it to look like I just had one glorious piece of floss that never ended, so I could stitch this perfectly from beginning to end. And it's a long stretch, so that's really not possible. On this kit, there are supposed to be little red sequins along the green zigzag stitched area. But since I knew I had all this outline stitching to do, I decided to hold off on putting those sequins on because I would have a tendency to just snag the floss on those sequins as I'm doing the work. So the sequins really can go on anytime. Since there's no stuffing here, it's not a problem. So we're getting close to this edge.